So excited to be here tonight. I am Margie Green. Some of you may have already met me in earlier classes, and I'm with Sprout NOLA. So Sprout is a farmer and gardener technical training and assistance nonprofit, and we're here in partnership with Recirculating Farms in this USDA Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program that we're all partnered on. So we're very excited to use these classes as a way to help people get intros to concepts of vegetable growing and hydroponics and aquaponics, because there's been a huge uptick in interest in food production, possibly related to COVID-19. And we're just very, very excited to help translate a lot of that interest to new growers, whatever the scale. So we're really excited that these classes are able to both introduce people who might want to pursue a career in agriculture to these concepts and set them up to take their next steps, as well as folks who might want to just stay really awesome and hardcore home growers, or maybe community gardeners, urban farmers, the whole spectrum. So we're happy to serve everyone. And tonight we're going to be doing a basic vegetable production series of Veggies 101. So giving those really, elementary, although at some points it'll feel like a science class, but we're laying the groundwork, theory behind vegetable production to help kind of equip you for what you're maybe already seeing in your own vegetable garden, or to get ready to really start production yourself. So, like I said, this is a Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. These are classes that are funded as part of the Farm Bill to help people all over the country. They're administered by different nonprofits and universities and organizations all over the country to help new farmers and ranchers start to develop. You'll be learning the basics of vegetable growing, and then also understanding the available resources to continue that journey. So like I said, it's a 101 class. If some of you might find that it's a little bit below where you are, some of you might find it's a little bit above, but don't worry, because all of this information will be relevant to you eventually, and we'll have a Q&A time at the end, so you can maybe sort of close some of those gaps, because we try to cast a wide net and meet everybody where they're at. So hopefully the information plugs in somewhere in the work that you're already doing. This is a beginner level to help build skills, and we will be having future advanced levels of all of these concepts. So tonight, the way that we'll be orienting the class is we're going to cover these 4 S's, and I teach with these sort of like gimmicks like that. And so when I was laying out this class, I decided the way that we were going to learn tonight was site, soil, seeds, and sickness. Each one of these categories is huge. There could be multiple classes on each one of the things. There could be multiple classes on each one of the subheadings of one of the things. But we'll be giving that basic overview, and again, having time for questions and answers. And with that in mind, hopefully we can really create some broad knowledge here. So site is going to be a lot about your site selection, where you're growing, and those sort of immovable factors of where you're beginning to plant your vegetables. Soil is going to be an overall concept about both soil structure and texture, but also a little bit of a deeper dive into soil nutrition, which is one of the things that is a big gap for new growers, because it seems like the most mystical part of growing, and it's a hard thing to get like a comprehensive overview of from Googling. And I think that there are definitely people who still go buy books and pore over them, but sometimes when you're starting a new task, you start with Googling and you can get tons of misinformation from all over the internet. So we're trying to clear some stuff up here. And then seeds. So we're going to be doing overall concepts on seed starting, and then transplant starting. And that'll also encompass a little bit of that planting and that spacing and the timing of planting things. And then lastly, a thing that I also feel like gets really mystified for new farmers and gardeners, which is sickness. So we'll be talking about plant pathology in a very broad way, and helping people start to identify the things that might be going wrong in their gardens that can oftentimes make new gardeners feel like they have a black thumb, which is a concept that we don't believe in. There is no such thing as someone who can't grow plants. There are just people who haven't gotten the skills yet. And for the most part, it's people who are really, really eager to learn to grow things, and they're actually making mistakes by being overly committed to their plants and overly precious with their plants. So maybe we'll let you be able to like relax a little bit and let the process of growing, which is a, you know, natural process, take the reins a little bit more. So, site. When we talk about site tonight, we're going to be talking about sun, water, and safe proximity. Sunlight is a non-negotiable in growing food. A lot of the time we'll see people who are really trying to kind of parse their relationship with sun, maybe in a backyard or on a neighboring property, or maybe, you know, on a property that they purchased to grow on. And unfortunately, there's no way around it. Most vegetable crops are going to require 8 hours of direct sunlight. Now, I want to pause here and say that what I teach and also what I know is traditional in-ground field agriculture. And so there are always going to be workarounds on these sorts of things with alternative agriculture models, which are amazing things that you can learn about in the RFC pieces of this series. So there are obviously sun lamps that can be used for indoor growing, you know, overhead lighting, and there's lighting that can be done in greenhouse production. But in terms of land-based agriculture, you have to have 8 hours of direct sunlight for most vegetable crops. 6 hours of direct sunlight will work for some of your winter crops, but photosynthesis really gets inhibited below 6 hours of direct sunlight, and it's optimal at about 8 hours of direct sunlight. When I say direct sunlight, what I mean is that there's nothing impeding sunlight falling on your plant's leaves between the sun and the plant itself. So partial shade that's coming from an oak tree in your backyard is going to be an issue. That's not direct sunlight. When you don't have 8 hours of direct sunlight, you can start encountering some disease issues. And that's because your plant is weaker. It's less able to photosynthesize, which is obviously how the plant creates food for itself. And so we don't want to be inhibiting the process of a plant taking care of itself. Also, in those low light situations, we'll have general growth issues, vigor issues, because again, that photosynthesis is being inhibited. There are things to do with shady spots, so you shouldn't just throw up your hands if you're unable to find a direct sun, full sun piece of land to grow on. Obviously, mushroom cultivation is really amazing, having spaces to rest, process vegetables, wash things, do your seeding. There's plenty of things that you can do in a shady spot, but growing food is not going to be your ideal condition there. So watering is our next set of things to talk about in our site selection. Watering is going to make all of the difference. And I'm already laughing because I can see that there's maybe something written in white or maybe something left out there, but we'll talk it through. Watering is going to make all the difference in your planting because obviously plants are mostly made of water. Just like people, water is essential to the life of plants, and all of their cells are mostly filled with water. And so whenever you lose, you know, the amount of water that is needed in a plant for its vigor and health, it'll start to wilt. The best way to think about what's happening when a plant wilts is that that cell, which is rigid but also flexible, is full of water, and so it's plump. And the plant is, you know, erect, and the leaves are facing upwards, and they're getting all the sun that they need, and they're breathing and they're photosynthesizing. When the plant starts losing more water through its leaves, through the process of transpiration, than it's taking in, it starts to get a little bit stressed out. Those leaves are going to wilt as a protection measure to try to basically hold on to all the water that's left in the plant. And that is not a big deal if it happens once or twice. It's definitely not a big deal if it happens right at planting, which is a very stressful time for plants. But what you want to be looking for is what we call the permanent wilting point. The permanent wilting point of a plant is something that as you begin to grow plants, you'll learn to kind of intuitively be able to see. And once a plant has hit the permanent wilting point, there's no coming back. So when the cells are forever changed because they've lost water and they've begun to dry out and the tissue of the plant has begun to die, you've reached the permanent wilting point. You never want to be there. So long-term water stress, which means getting a plant close to the permanent wilting point and bringing it back over and over again, essentially creating a cycle of stress in a plant's life, is going to create long-term problems for the plant. even if that water loss isn't the current issue that the plant is facing. So water stress in a plant's life will make it less adaptable when there are freeze conditions, less adaptable when there are heat conditions, and it'll make it not set fruit. Because one of the things that I want every grower to start conceptualizing of is that a plant is a living thing, and it's making choices is a little bit of choices is maybe giving plants a little bit too much of like people qualities, anthropomorphizing plants, but they are making natural choices about what to do with their energy. So if a plant only has so much energy and it's stressed out all the time, instead of making fruit or flowering correctly, what it's actually going to do is it's going to shut down and protect its leaves. Now there is a kind of variation on this, which is that a lot of the time you'll see a plant that's been so stressed throughout its entire life and it's beginning to die will do exactly what a lot of animals do, a lot of living things do, which is it'll make a last-ditch effort to try to recreate, try to procreate. And so sometimes you'll see plants that have been so stressed and root-bound in their container for their whole lives, and they really haven't gotten what they need for the entirety of their time on this earth, and they will start flowering really profusely. And what that is it's sort of a death knell for plants. So oftentimes we'll see people with a little 4-inch pot of a really stressed out plant, and I'll be like, oh, I think that plant might be ready to be composted and you should start again. And the common refrain is sort of like, but it's flowering all over. And so when we start to conceptualize of plants as living things with, again, will is maybe a little too anthropomorphic, but a desire to procreate and have like a long, healthy life, then that behavior makes a little bit more sense, that profuse flowering on a small, stressed out plant is a first sign of death. So you want to avoid killing your plants early through, basically abuse by creating long-term watering systems that allow that plant to thrive. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end, but watering should also be done in a way that is meant to encourage plants to create more sustainable root systems. So when you think about those roots as responding to external factors, you always want to be watering either infrequently and deeply with plants that you want to have an established root system to be able to handle those drought periods better, or if you are going to be able to put your plants on some sort of irrigation system, you want to water frequently and deeply. So if you have good drainage, it's okay to water on a pretty frequent basis as long as plants aren't standing with wet feet. When we're thinking about water, if the roots are completely covered in water, there's no ability for there to be oxygen exchange. And when you think about plant roots, we often think all they do is drink water, but they actually need to breathe as well. And so we're trying to balance the time that they're completely submerged in water with the time that they're able to breathe too. So if plant roots are constantly underwater and it's not an aquatic plant, which is most vegetables, then they're not going to be able to get that air. And while it will cause disease and rot, it'll also mean that they can't breathe and they'll die. The symptoms of overwatering a plant and underwatering a plant look exactly the same, because the repercussion of overwatering a plant and underwatering a plant are the same, which is that the plant is no longer getting water. So if you rot those roots by not allowing them to breathe, the symptom on the top is going to be wilting. And if you don't water that plant and it doesn't have water, then the wilting symptom is going to be the same thing. So don't think of a symptom that you're seeing on a plant as having one solution. There's often multiple overlapping factors that you'll learn to identify throughout your life with plants. The next thing that we want to talk about really quickly is safe proximity, especially in urban homestead situations or small farms. They're often interconnected systems of plants and animals. But when you're growing in ground, and especially food, you need to have quite a bit of a buffer between animals and plants because of raw manure that can cause food safety issues. And especially, if animals get out, which they are wont to do, then you also don't want that manure being brought into whatever your garden situation is. So we recommend about a 40-foot buffer between animals and plants, and especially in New Orleans where we can have rapid standing water because of heavy rains. It's important because that water is going to take whatever is with it into your garden. And so that also relates to your storm water. When our water rises in the city rapidly, all of those toxins and contaminants that might be on the street from someone changing their oil or from a porta potty being left out or something like that, all of that's standing in the water, and so it can come into your field. So you want to be making sure that when you're planting your garden, it's not a place that frequently floods in rain incidents. All right, soil. This is a big one. And I feel like we're gonna kind of get into high school biology again. So I hope everybody's like ready to do some learning. So soil is obviously the main concern, the biggest thing when you're gardening. Healthy plants are awesome, but if you don't have healthy soil, no matter what you put in it, isn't going to thrive. So soil is a complex, living, interconnected organism, or it is many interconnected organisms. You can see in this picture all of the root hairs and the mycorrhizae in the soil surrounding this little baby pine sapling. And so when we conceive of soil as a dense and living organism, it's a lot more easy to understand why we try not to disturb it too terribly much, and why we try to really facilitate it becoming more densely connected and having more life in it. The soil is a bank, and I say that a lot, and it is one of the most important concepts in growing food. The soil is a bank, and if we are only ever making withdrawals from that bank, then we're not going to have enough to keep growing things. So a quote that you probably also remember from your high school science classes that I think is the best example of this is that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. What I mean by that in terms of soil is that there are nutrients in your soil, and when you grow a plant, it creates its above ground parts based on water and then the photosynthesis that happens in that plant using the nutrients that it is pulling out of the ground in order to create new cells. So because the matter of the plant that's above ground can't just be created from thin air, it's actually things that are being removed from the soil to create that plant. That's important when you're thinking about removing waste from your garden. It's important when you're thinking about how often you're feeding your plants. Just conceiving of everything that you do in the soil as being a give and a take, and you have to give back. A lot of traditional agriculture doesn't conceive of the soil as a living thing or as something that we need to give back to in order to create an overall picture of health for the soil. What we do when we are only fertilizing the plant instead of building strong soil is that we're essentially feeding the plant for just that season, and we have to come back and do that same thing every single season. So it's almost like we're giving a plant an IV in order to grow rather than feeding it healthy food its whole life. Obviously, there are going to be times where plants need an IV drip system and we have to get something to them quick. But the best case scenario when growing plants is to have a healthy system and a healthy base of soil for them for their whole lives. So when we talk about nutrients in the soil, there are 3 nutrients that are going to be used in the heaviest quantity. We call those macronutrients, and they are, they are the most prevalent nutrients in soil, and also deficiency of macronutrients eventually leads to death. So they're written often on fertilizer bags as NPK. You probably know this from looking at a fertilizer bag that has 3 numbers on it. You might see 13 as like a common agricultural farm fertilizer, but then those organic fertilizers are going to have lower numbers. So when I say 13, I mean a bag saying 13, 13, 13. But maybe an organic fertilizer might say 500. The first number stands for nitrogen, the second number for phosphorus, and the third for potassium. And the number that it correlates to is how many pounds of that amendment are actually in 100 pounds of the bag. So in 100 pounds of 13, you have 13 pounds of nitrogen, 13 pounds of phosphorus, 13 pounds of potassium. Same with a 500, you get 5 pounds of organic nitrogen. Your numbers are always going to be lower with organics because they're less dense in nutrients. because more of what else is in there is going to be that organic matter or whatever the product that the nutrient is coming from. So maybe chicken manure, composted chicken manure is going to have a low number because there's going to be a whole lot of other stuff. Everything that those chickens ate, all of the digested grass, all of the bedding that they might have been on, that makes up the other 95 pounds of that 100, but you're still getting 5 good pounds of nitrogen. So I put right here, again, going into our science class, the nitrogen cycle. And this helps nail home that concept that matter is not created nor destroyed, neither is nitrogen. So nitrogen is atmospheric, it's in the air. And you can see up there the atmospheric nitrogen floating at the top of the screen as N2. And the way that we're getting that back into the soil is that we are trapping it with our leguminous crops. So you might have heard that there are crops that fix nitrogen or take nitrogen from the air, and there are things in the legume family, like peanuts or beans or peas. And so they're actually breathing in atmospheric nitrogen, and there's little bacterial nodules on their roots that fix that nitrogen from the air back into the soil. It's an awesome process, and it's why growing legumes in your garden actually makes your soil inherently healthier over time. Another way that we can get nitrogen back into the soil is by adding compost. So you see there's a rabbit here. You know, we can add rabbit droppings. We can make compost from rabbit manure. Obviously, we can make compost from any kind of manure, but in the picture, we've got a rabbit. And then as we decompose any living thing, which is largely made of nitrogen, because nitrogen is the thing needed in the highest quantity, we can put those nutrients back into the soil. So if you conceive of cutting down a tree that's been growing for 30 years, and all of the nitrogen in that tree is tied up in that tree, it was all taken from the ground over 30 years. As that tree breaks back down, the nitrogen can either be released into the air, whatever is in contact with the soil or below the soil is going to be incorporated back into the soil. And so if we think about that nitrogen as a really, really high value nutrient that we need in the highest quantity, the idea that we would put that tree into a dump where we lock that nitrogen away forever it becomes a little bit more compelling to try to keep a closed cycle in your soil and put everything back that you possibly can. There are going to be reasons that you can't, obviously, but to whatever degree you can put that nitrogen back into the soil is great, because then you're not having to buy nitrogen or do all of the work of going out and finding other people's trees and composting them. So let me move this so I can see. So nitrogen is mobile in plants, and you're going to hear about nutrients being mobile or immobile. And when I say mobile, what I mean is it can actually move throughout the plant. Some of our nutrients are actually not able to move throughout the plant, and once they're fixed in a place in the plant, that's where they stay. The reason that this matters is that when a plant has a mobile nutrient in it, like nitrogen, if it begins to have a deficiency, it can still send that nitrogen up to the newest growth. Again, going back to that concept that plants have a will and they're trying to protect their future generations, if they're low on something, they're going to send it to the new growth first because they're trying to protect kind of like the baby. And so you'll start to see those symptoms showing up on the old growth. And what that is most commonly going to look like is yellowing of those lower leaves, which is a very natural process. Once a plant puts out leaves, they're not going to live forever. You know, you might have a house plant or plants at your farm or whatever, where you're seeing some death of lower leaves, and that's not a bad thing always. Not every leaf is going to live forever. But if you're consistently seeing yellowing of those lower leaves, you should be considering that you might have a nitrogen deficiency, which again, because plants need nitrogen in the very highest quantity, is a very common deficiency to have. A lot of soils that are low in organic matter or have been grown in for a long time and never really fed are going to have that lower level of nitrogen. But the good thing is it's a very easy fix, because most fertilizers, whether they're synthetic or organic, are going to be high in nitrogen. Because it is the heaviest feeder, is the thing that is needed most by plants, deficiency does lead to death. So you will never see full nitrogen deficiency because all living things have nitrogen in them. So there's never a complete absence of nitrogen, but even approaching that complete lack of nitrogen will lead to lack of vigor and death for that plant. So I'm going to take a sip of water because I'm talking a lot. So since nitrogen naturally exists in the environment in clean and cheap ways, you would maybe reason that we should focus on using that already available nitrogen and not using our resources to create more synthetic nitrogen. Organic nitrogen used in an organic growing process is made by the composting of solid waste and the addition of other organic amendments. When we compost, we're turning a bunch of that solid waste back into nutrient-rich soil with tons of good microbes, worms, and fungus that acts as caretakers of the soil. So think of this as a system of like making sourdough bread with a starter. It takes a long time to learn to do, and it requires the right environment, but it is a longer process that yields a more complex product. It creates food, but it feeds the soil naturally through nitrogen fixation long term. And so one of the things that you'll hear about people doing is using cover crops to add nitrogen back. So I want to kind of draw this distinction. You're adding nitrogen by putting organic matter back into the soil and by putting all of that decomposing plant matter back into the soil that's maybe coming from other things like when you're harvesting a plant out. But you can also do what we call cover cropping. So cover cropping is the intentional planting of green matter, whatever plant that might be. It could be buckwheat, it could be oats, it could be sun hemp. And you're planting that plant not to harvest, but to actually turn back into soil. So you plant it, you mow it down, and then you flip the soil on top of it to trap that nitrogen in the soil. Because again, you can lose that nitrogen atmospherically. So if you leave plant residue on the surface of the soil, it's not to say it's terrible, you're still, using it in the garden, it's nice as mulch, you'll get some in the soil, but you're losing a lot of that nitrogen to the air. So I always like covering up the sources of nitrogen that I am pursuing reincorporating into my garden. Anything that's around you that's ever been a living thing contains nitrogen. And so if you allowed any of these things to break down into the soil, they would replenish it eventually. Some things are large and have limited surface area, and it would take a long time for those things to break down naturally. So you don't want to be burying a big tree stump in your garden because that's not going to break down quickly. The microbes in the soil have to actually attack it and start to break it down, like worms and bacteria. And this is why we expedite that process of reincorporation into the soil by composting. So when we compost, we actually can get the temperature and the amount of microbes and bacteria up to such a high degree that that breakdown process happens really quickly. And so compost is going to be an incredibly nitrogen-rich product. It's a little bit more complex of a process than I'm going to lay it out, but I think it's important to start talking about it, which is that in composting, we need to have a balance of carbon, which is the basis of all living things, and nitrogen. And when you think about carbon, think about dry, crunchy, brown things. So cardboard and wood chips and paper. All of those things are really, really carbon rich. They're higher on the carbon side than they are on the nitrogen side, but they do contain both things. They all contain carbon and nitrogen. They're just heavier on carbon. And then your green, wet things are going to contain more nitrogen than carbon. Again, they have carbon, but they have more nitrogen than carbon. And so you want to balance that nitrogen and carbon so that the process of breaking down turns it into soil. If you have too much nitrogen in whatever you are trying to break down, it will turn into slime, gross, smelly, quickly cooking, very hot slime. And if you have too much carbon, then what will happen is what's probably happened at your house if you left, a pile of wood chips will break down pretty quickly. A pile of cardboard, it's just going to blow away and dry out, and it's not going to turn into soil really. So you have to add that wet, which is the nitrogen, to the dry in order to make new soil. Applying that concept to how you add your organic matter, your nitrogen into soil, if you are adding something that's so heavy in carbon, like a chunk of tree, in the short term, all of the microbes that would be digesting and creating a complex soil structure and feeding your plant are going to run over to that chunk of wood and they're going to start focusing on just that chunk of wood because it's a big chunk of wood with a lot of surface area. And when they start focusing on that, they don't focus on feeding your plants. And they do a thing that we call tying up nitrogen. So the nitrogen focused on the carbon that you put in the soil, not focused on the plant. It's all tied up. It doesn't have time for your plant. And in that process, we actually see a lot of nitrogen deficiencies for a season or maybe two that lead to long-term more nitrogen in the soil, but short-term, they actually create a deficiency. So to put that on its feet and explain like real time what I mean by that is that we mulch in a garden in order to keep weeds down, in order to retain soil moisture, and in order to actually build up organic matter if we're using, you know, an organic mulch. So if you mulch with hay, like long term, that hay is going to break down into the soil structure and it's going to feed it. If you mulch with wood chips, which are big old chunks of tree, they're heavy in carbon. All of the soil bacteria on that top surface of the soil where the carbon meets the nitrogen are going to get tied up, and the plants that you have planted in a wood chipped mulched garden are going to exhibit some nitrogen deficiency in that first season while that breakdown is happening in your garden. So that's the process of composting happening in the field. If you were to take those wood chips and put them over in a pile and let them break down on their own into soil and incorporate that soil, you would actually fight a nitrogen deficiency. So there are some workarounds to that if you want to mulch with something that's heavy carbon, which would be that you could give some quick nitrogen to those plants to counteract that they were having an initial deficiency. And that can come in the form of any of these organic fertilizers. I grow organically, so I like to call those things out. There are obviously synthetic fertilizers that I'll talk about in a second, but liquid fertilizers are going to be quicker in getting to a plant than a granular fertilizer. So something that looks like cereal or, you know, cat food, that's going to break down slower because it has to interact with water in order to release those nutrients into the ground, rather than something that you dump into your watering can and mix up with water and give straight to the plant. So if you planted a broccoli plant, which is going to be a heavy feeder on nitrogen because it's got those big leafy green leaves, and you mulched it with your wood chips and it starts to show a nitrogen deficiency, what you would want to do is a quick fertilization with fish emulsion, or, you know, you could do blood. A lot of people do blood, actually rehydrating blood meal in a watering can, and that's a slaughterhouse product that you can purchase organically. In terms of synthetically, nitrogen can be fixed from the atmosphere through a process called the Haber-Bosch process that was created in the 1920s, actually around creating a nitrogen bomb. That's when we first figured out how to process nitrogen in a lab. And it's very, very cheap, and that nitrogen is very potent, and it's so potent that it's very easy to burn plants with it. So, you know, synthetic nitrogen does not feed soil microbes as well. In fact, it can hurt them in too high quantities. And so it really is a balance between, do you want the cheap and the quick nitrogen that's synthetically made and can actually be somewhat detrimental to soil structure, or the more expensive, slower, organic nitrogen? And I would say there's a really wonderful answer in between, which is that if you're feeding your soil with the things that you are composting on farm, and you have a closed system of trying to reincorporate organic matter into the ground and nitrogen into the ground, then you don't have to make that choice. You can just always be feeding your soil. I am actually going to go ahead and pause for 1 second and see if there are any questions. If you want to throw them into the chat really quickly. I know I said there was a Q&A at the end, but I also feel like we're doing some heavy, like dense information, and I want to make sure that people don't lose their thread or their question if they want it answered right now. So if anyone has any quick questions that they'd like to throw into the chat, let me know. I'm going to take a sip of water. Awesome. I'm going to keep moving on nitrogen, but if you have any questions, do let me know. Oh, what is a good ratio of carbon to nitrogen in a compost pile, and how can you keep your pile warm? So a good ratio is going to be 3-to-1, which means you want a lot more carbon than you do nitrogen. And again, thinking about that real time, it's like how many paper bags are you tearing up to put with like a slimy piece of bok choy to make that into soil instead of a pile of slimy bok choy or a dry pile of cardboard. So you want 3 times in terms of weight the brown matter or the carbon as you want with the nitrogen. And that's what's going to make fluffy, wonderful chocolate cake compost versus slime or dry. And in terms, and that's like a goal that you're looking for. And if you're making compost professionally, you obviously need to be monitoring that really, really closely. If you're making a home or your own on-farm compost pile, it can be a little bit more intuitive. And what you're going to be watching for are symptoms of that pile having a hard time. So if the pile seems dry, add more wet. If the pile seems wet, add more dry. And then in terms of keeping your pile warm, what we're referring to there is that you actually have to get compost up to a pretty high temperature. Depending on what is in the compost, the temperature is different. And let me see if I actually have. The Rodale composting book is really phenomenal, and it's got lots of charts in it if you're interested in compost about the temperature that you want to get each individual pile to in order to kill pathogens and weed seeds. But in order to make sure that your compost is actually coming together and creating its own heat from microbial activity. So all of those microbes start digesting everything inside the pile, and they actually start heating it up. To make sure that that pile is heating up, you want the appropriate ratio of carbon to nitrogen so that those microbes can start doing their business. And then you also want density of a pile. So you can make a teeny tiny little pile of torn up vegetables and dry paper, and it's not going to start cooking. It's not going to start making microbial activity. You actually need a pile that's substantial enough that things can be happening on the inside that are not exposed to the outside world. So I am sure that there is like a perfect answer to this, but I would say that a pile that's below 3 feet high is not going to start cooking. That doesn't mean it won't turn into compost eventually, like slowly, but in order to get it up to a really high temperature and kill any seeds that are in there from potential weeds or any disease that's in there, I wouldn't go below 3 feet. And then thinking about, how to get the amount of waste you might be producing to that height. I also like to keep things tight. So about 3 feet by 3 feet would probably be the smallest pile that you ever wanted to try to like genuinely make good compost at home. Ooh, I didn't even talk about that. So thinking about nitrogen as we're weeding, when we remove weeds from the ground, we're removing their nitrogen. Weeds are incredibly competitive in how they get resources. That's why they're weeds, right? There's no other definition for them except for that they can outcompete other plants, and we didn't put them there. And so those weeds are efficient at getting nitrogen. Unfortunately, they have seed heads and they harbor disease. So a lot of the time we can't compost them. But if you can compost your weeds, if you're sure that they won't come back from that root system, depending on the weed, then it's a nice idea too, because they were so efficient in getting that nitrogen, you don't want to lose it. Turning compost, you want to think about all of the nitrogen, that you can create with composting. Harvesting, when you're removing fruit or when you're removing leaves from a plant, you're actually taking nitrogen away from them and allowing them to focus their energy on the next thing that you need them to do. And then prepping beds. When you're adding compost as you're prepping beds, that compost is replenishing what you've removed through harvest, through weeding, and then also through turning the soil at any point. Because anytime you turn the soil, you are losing nitrogen to the air, you're losing carbon, and all of those things are fine and they're natural processes, but just think about them as you go because you need to be replenishing. All right. Phosphorus, the second one. So phosphorus supports the general growth of plants, namely their ability to sort of replicate their own RNA and DNA. A lot of people will tell you that phosphorus is fruit and flower development. That's not super strongly supported. I do still sort of inherently believe it. And I think a lot of people do, especially hydroponic growers. And there is some evidence that high phosphorus can cue flowering, but it's not like the nutrient that makes flowering happen, which is something that's often talked about. Phosphorus is essential to photosynthesis. So we obviously have to have it in high amounts in our plants. And it naturally exists in the soil because of organic matter from rock waste. Bone also is very high in phosphorus. And so you'll often see, when I talked about that slaughterhouse product of blood, which is nitrogen, you'll often see bagged bone meal, actually. So you'll see that bagged bone meal, and you can actually put it out and it's ground up into a very fine powder, which means the surface area is small and it's able to be released into the soil. Here's our phosphorus cycle, but I'm not going to make you go through every single cycle. All right, so we have bone meal. There are also naturally occurring products like kelp and bat guano. If sourced responsibly, they're a really nice way to add phosphorus to your soil. Compost is going to increase that microbial activity and worm populations and organic matter. And so, you know, obviously always thinking about how you can keep this a closed system. Rock phosphates are really high in phosphorus, but they break down slowly in acidic environments and virtually not at all in alkaline environments. We'll talk about pH in a second. But yeah, phosphorus is just a nice thing to be added through composting, because a lot of these products that you're gonna have to buy in order to add phosphorus back to your soil are actually shipped from all over the world, and sometimes they are mined in really abusive ways, and it really makes you question, you know, if we're trying to create a more vibrant food system that is more sustainable, going and mining bat guano, you know, and shipping it here to America is like maybe not the way to do that. So thinking about how you can get phosphorus in ways that are a little more ethical and a little closer to you. When I was doing a certified naturally grown certification the other day on farm, doing a check, one of the questions that they asked that I thought was really amazing was, are you using amendments that are sourced locally in your own community? And so thinking of places that you might see waste that's high in phosphorus in your own community is a really awesome idea. You know, fish, the bones of fish are going to be thrown away from fish houses all around. And also that flesh is going to be super high in nitrogen, and the blood of the fish is going to be really high in nitrogen. So like, how do we go and get fish refuse and bring it onto our farm and grind it up and have fish compost? So things like that can be really cheap as well. Potassium, which is our third highest need, the biggest macronutrient, is actually the culprit behind fruit development, though phosphorus is often credited. Potassium regulates the opening and closing of the plant's stomata. So earlier when I talked about transpiration, which is the process of plants breathing and losing water, potassium is in charge of that opening and closing. Deficiencies of potassium are going to be recognized in the stunting of plants and their bad responses to temperature change. So if you have a potassium deficiency, when we have those random freezes in, you know, October, November that occasionally happen, then you're going to see you know, a lot more damage if you have a long-term potassium deficiency. It also leads to abnormal fruit development, like tomatoes. So we want to be avoiding those, because once we start to see symptoms, it's too late to treat them. You can't say, oh, my grown tomato plant is having a problem with blossom end rot, and then come through and fix that immediately. You're going to have to fix it for the next season. There's some spot fixes, but having healthy soil is really going to be the key. So our potassium is going to be coming from green sand, which is a naturally occurring component that's 5% available potassium. When I say available, that's what's actually unlockable to plants. And it is expensive, and it's not often available here in Louisiana. Manure is going to be an awesome source of potassium, and then rock powders and wood ash. So the thing about rock powders and wood ash is they're going to be alkalizing of the soil. They're going to make it more basic. And here in New Orleans, our soil is already extremely basic. Now, if you go over to the North Shore, the soil is extremely acidic. So you need to be soil testing to know what you want to do. And I think as we move out of this And I'll be sharing this PowerPoint. I know there's a lot of stuff on here. So as we move out of this section, I want to encourage you to soil test. Always be soil testing. And I'll give you some resources on how to do that so that you're not shooting in the dark with what you're adding to your soil. Again, going back to how we're trying to create a more sustainable landscape of agriculture. If we put inputs, if you go out and purchase any of these nutrients and your soil doesn't need them, then you actually, even though they're organic and they're safe, have created an environmental issue by nature of having runoff. Nitrogen is nitrogen, and when we have nitrogen runoff or phosphorus runoff into waterways that are hurting fish, it doesn't actually matter if it was synthetic nitrogen or organic nitrogen. It just matters that there was too much nitrogen in surface water, too much phosphorus in surface water. So, you know, if organic and sustainable agriculture purports to be better for the environment, we have to actually practice what we preach. So don't just spray and pray. Don't just assume that your soil needs something. Really be looking into what your soil needs by doing a soil test. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to pause here again. We got our nitrogen, our phosphorus, and our potassium. Do we have any, I have to find the chat, have any questions about that right now? Yeah, so we can talk about that right now, absolutely. So great places to get soil tested are gonna be for just your nutrients. You can send those in to LSU Ag Center. They're gonna have these little kits that are about the size of VHS tapes, and they're available at Jeff Feed, which is over there on Jefferson Highway, and then they have a couple of other locations. And those kits are free to get from feed stores, but you're gonna need to send in money to LSU when you send the test in. What that's going to give you is the general availability of nutrients in your soil. If you want to take that up a step and find out, you know, your organic matter content, as well as maybe your heavy metals, then you're going to want to send that soil to LSU's Caligari Center. And at Caligari, they're going to be doing a more comprehensive panel of your soil. And then other wonderful places to get your soil tested all over the country. If you don't want to keep it local, you can send your soil to Cornell, you can send it to Oregon. There are going to be extension offices at almost any college or university you can think of, Tufts, where you can just send in a sample of your soil, which will have its own instructions. Each soil lab is going to have its own instructions, and you can send that in and get a panel back on your soil. But the reason that I really encourage people to do it here is that you'll have an extension agent here in your area that you already might work with, or you should get to know, especially if you're in New Orleans. We have awesome extension agents. And so if you send it in here, they can help you interpret those results. Whereas someone somewhere else might be less inclined or available to help you actually look at the digitized version of a soil test that you're going to get and interpret what that actually means in your garden. So micronutrients, we talked about our macros, which are the big guys that we need in a really high amount. The micros, exactly like they sound, we need in smaller amounts. And each different plant is going to need different kinds of micronutrients, different layouts of micronutrients. For example, our cruciferous crops like our broccolis and cabbages, all of those like hardy winter greens need a lot of boron. And if they don't get a lot of boron, they actually get a rot up the center, which is just a symptom of that deficiency. But not a lot of other things need a ton of boron. So knowing the crop that you're growing and what it needs, and then being able to sort of familiarize yourself with what your soil's micronutrients are like through testing, but you do not need to memorize all of the deficiencies of micronutrients. And then we talked about soil pH a little bit. There's a question, any suggestions on inexpensive ways to mitigate soil problems? And I would ask if we want to, can we clarify a little bit about what the soil what soil problems might be in order to sort of address that more? Because I think, yeah, I'll wait for some clarification on that and then I'll answer that. The pH of your soil is defined as the negative logarithm of hydrogen ions, and that is not what you need to take away. So let's talk a little bit about what that means in real time. pH is a scale that is best understood by a gardener or a farmer as thinking about acidity to alkalinity, so acid to base. Extremely acid is going to be all the way on one side of the scale, which is going to be everything. So the scale is 1 to 14, and your higher numbers are going to be more alkaline, your lower numbers are going to be more acidic. So when you look at what I have here, which I think comes from SUNY, the extremely acid side of that range is going to be something like stomach acid or lemon juice, or maybe, boric acid we have on here, acetic acid, vinegar, all the way to your more basic things, which are going to be things like milk or ammonia, bleach, and lime. So thinking of soil pH as a spectrum, which all the way over here on the left, to me at least, we have strongly acid, and all the way over here on the right, we have strongly alkaline. Your nutrients are going to be available at different levels depending on your soil's pH. So all you need to take away from this is that there is a very slightly acid column right here, which is about 6.5 to 7, that plants are going to thrive best in. As you can see, the availability of all of our nutrients is the highest in that column. So plants want to have slightly acid to essentially middle of the road, or what we call neutral, pH. Unfortunately, here in New Orleans, we have crazy alkaline soils, and that can often mean above 9, which might not seem like that different from 7, but each step on this chart is actually, because it's an algorithm, a logarithm, is actually multiplied by a ton. So the jump from 7 to 9 is huge. So when your soil is on the more alkaline side, you want to be correcting that by acidifying it. And when it's on the acid side, you're going to be correcting that by liming it, essentially. So acid soils, we add lime or rock phosphates to them in order to bring them back to that alkaline side. And you'll see, people call that sweetening their soil. It's something that, a lot of old timers in vegetable gardens just will add lime no matter what. They'll just always add lime to a garden because, for the most part, a lot of rural soils are going to be on the acidic side. But again, here in New Orleans, we have a more alkaline soil. So what you actually are going to be adding is elemental sulfur to that soil, which can be purchased as, broken up elemental soil, and or elemental sulfur, which is going to be interacting with your soil and slowly acidifying it. When you're putting sulfur on your soil, you need to be very careful, because once you put out a corrective on soil pH, you can't stop that process. There's not going to be a way to get that sulfur back up out of your soil. And if you don't apply the right amount, what's going to happen is you're going to way acidify your soil, and you could make it like completely barren forever. And so while lime will actually kind of mellow out over time, acid is going to be like, especially that elemental sulfur, is going to be like super acid for a really long time. What I like to do is try to take corrective measures that are a little bit slower and help build organic matter. And my favorite one here in the city is to mulch with pine straw instead of anything else. It's really nice to mulch with pine straw because it's renewable, it's cheap, it doesn't have weed seed in it, and pine naturally over time acidifies the soil. The leaf of a pine tree just actually breaks down to be more acidic in soil than anything else. So I really, really recommend New Orleans gardeners go ahead and mulch with pine straw if at all possible, which you can get by calling Gomez Pine Straw, and they'll like deliver. It's literally the easiest gardening trick in the world. It just shows up at your house if you call them. I don't like to sound like a commercial for lots of different places, but like Gomez Pine Straw is great. So then really quickly, we're going to flip back to these micronutrients again. We're not going to go through each one of these, but I do want you to understand how you could visualize of deficiencies, especially with, if somebody could answer me in the chat, can you see my pointer? Does my pointer show up on the screen? Awesome. So when you look at this, I like this because there's one single plant leaf that, or like one, leaflet that is showing you what could be a symptom of a micronutrient deficiency. So you'll see that a lot of the time there are similar deficiencies leaf to leaf, but they're going to have differences between whether the veins of the leaf or what's in between the veins of the leaf is having a symptom. So let's look. Yeah, so on zinc, our leaf veins are dark green, whereas on iron, our leaves, oh no, our veins are green on iron, of course, that's how it looks. I want to see where there's yellowing veins. Yeah, okay, so with sulfur, our veins are going to be pale green. So there's so many tiny little distinctions, and to be honest, the best thing to do if you're having a serious problem and your production is for profit is to actually send in a plant tissue sample. And there's something important here to be understood, which is that there is a chasm between what your soil can give a plant and what the plant takes up. And there could be a lot of things going wrong in between there. Generally, what's going to be going wrong there is pH. And so getting your soil tested and seeing what's available in the soil is really the first step, and it's very, very good. But to occasionally get a plant tissue sample tested, again, it's going to be that LSU plant laboratory that can do this, is going to show you what happens. It's sort of the end result. It's like seeing your work on a math problem. And so being able to look at the tissue sample with a soil sample will help you tell this really complex story of what is actually happening in the ground between the veins and the roots of your plant and the finished product. And as you can see, we have boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc. And so these are going to be your micronutrients, and they can all be gotten through purchasing amendments or through composting certain items. For instance, iron, there's always going to be iron in blood, and blood is also acidic. So if you were having an alkaline, nitrogen deficient soil that was also deficient in iron, watering with blood would be a really good option for how to fix all of those problems slowly over time. Calcium. I bet you can guess all of the places calcium is going to be. It's going to be in bone. It's going to be in teeth. It's also in oyster shells. So adding calcium to your soil by the very renewable oyster shell industry down here. Yeah, so all of these things can be achieved in ways that aren't just going out and shopping. And again, I would really, really recommend, if you want to do a deep dive on any of this, is to look at that Rodale composting book, because it breaks down hair and kelp and fingernails and all of the stuff that you might weirdly have access to compost and in order to correct deficiencies. Great. So I've thrown around the word organic matter and nitrogen, and I think that I put this slide in here because I tend to use them interchangeably, but nitrogen is not organic matter. Organic matter is nitrogen. So organic matter is going to be really, really high in nitrogen, and it is essentially, organic matter is a blend of fresh residue of plants, living organisms, stabilized organic matter, which is also known as humus, and then decomposing organic matter, which is active. So if you think about a pile of horse manure, it's really high in organic matter, and what we want to pursue organic matter for is water holding capacity. So when you have more organic matter in your soil, it retains water better because it's made up of that plant material, which holds on to water because it's created by water. So mixing our sharper materials like sand and rock with organic matter is going to create soil. organic matter is essentially like the soft part of soil that's not clay, right? So soil is made up of sand and rock and clay and organic matter to create a, a textured substance that's giving all of those things to plants. So just thinking of organic matter as something bigger than just direct nitrogen, because without it, plants don't have the physical structure to grab onto in the ground, and the water is just going to go straight through your soil. So if you have dusty soil, if you have soil that cracks, biggest sign of low organic matter in your soil is going to be when it gets dry out, does it crack open? And whenever we till or turn that soil structure, we're losing organic matter by losing that nitrogen atmospherically. And so the more that you're tilling soil, the more you're breaking down its structure, and you're leading to the loss of organic matter, which means you're not retaining those nutrients as much. And long term, you're just going to create a lot of soil problems. So trying to disturb the soil as little as possible is going to help with that plant growth. And that is what I just told you. This is the definition of soil organic matter from the NRCS. It's a mouthful here, but it's exactly that same thing. And again, we'll share this PowerPoint because there's a lot of dense information in it. All right, I'm gonna pause again for a second here. Let people throw a question in the chat if they want. Gonna drink water again. Awesome. Oh, Michael asked, do you have to worry about tannins when mulching? I'm assuming that was when I was talking about mulching with pine straw. I have never had a problem with tannins building up in the soil. Tannic acid is going to be part of that acidification process. Theoretically, if you mulched with pine straw forever and ever and ever really densely, it would be a problem. I've personally not had a problem with that. I am very open to hearing if that has become a problem on anyone else's farm. But we have mulched with essentially only pine straw for over a decade, and I've never seen any negative repercussions from it, except for that slow acidification and increase in organic matter from the breaking down of the pine needles. Do throw it in the chat though if you've had a problem with it, because I want to hear about that. All right. So seeds, this is sort of my catch-all category for like, what are you planting? So transplants are going to be your baby plants. Some people call them starts. It is definitely regional what you call plants. So I call them transplants, but I find a lot of people in New Orleans, I learned transplants in Baton Rouge. A lot of people in New Orleans call them starts. It's the same thing. They're baby plants started in trays and then bumped up, potentially multiple times. When we say bumped up, it's the idea that we start with a small cell or a cell tray. You're going to see a picture of that in a second. And then we keep sizing those plants up. The theory behind that is that plants actually like some structure around their roots. They're like teenagers. They want some boundaries. And if you let a plant's roots get to the edge of the pot and then make one momentary movement down, then they're actually going to be healthier as you bump them up to the next size. You don't ever want to let a plant get what's called root bound, which means that those roots begin to circle on whatever container they're in. I'm sure everyone has the experience of pulling a plant out of a container, and one of two things, right? It's always either it just got bumped up, so there's a ton of soil around it, and you basically bought a tiny plant that had a ton of extra soil around it, and it cost the price of the next size up, but it's not the next size up yet. Or you pull a plant out and you can't get it out, and you have to cut the pot, and there's this huge swirling white mass around the outside of the plant. That is when a plant is root bound. Once those roots start growing in a circular direction, you're going to have to tell them with force that they can stop doing that. So that often comes from actually pruning the roots, cutting them, or ripping them apart so that they can actually start growing outwards, which can be a very traumatic experience for a lot of plants and a lot of gardeners. And so we try to avoid root-bound plants. The other way that you might be planting plants is seeds by direct seeding, which is cost-effective and space-efficient. Obviously, when you plant transplants, you're starting from seed, The process is different about what you're actually putting out in the ground. Are you putting a direct seed into the ground, or are you putting a plant that you started elsewhere in the ground? And then we also are going to have bulbs, corms, bare roots, crowns. There are going to be a couple of kinds of vegetable plants that grow with these different root structures that are coming into the ground as, you know, a physical object like a bulb. But for the most part, in vegetable production in Louisiana, we tend towards transplants and seeds. A quick note on why you might choose one over the other. Transplants, you can start them earlier and you can start them in a compact way. So it's the difference between going out and direct seeding a field or a row. Ooh, I don't know if you get that was magical. If you guys could see the text that just popped up on my window, it was a strawberry producer just texted me and was like, hey, I have more bare root strawberries if you need them, like right as I was talking about strawberries. So anyway, the advantage of starting with a transplant is going to be that you are going to get a head start on the plant, which can be seasonal, and it can also be for protecting it. Putting a 4-inch pot, which is about that big, it's that square pot that you're used to seeing in nurseries, out into the ground of a broccoli plant or a 6-pack is going to be a much, much healthier plant. It's going to be better able to fight diseases and pests than the tiniest little seedling that could just get plucked by a bird. But the downside to it is it does take more resources. You have to pay for the soil, the plastic pots, you have to have infrastructure to start them appropriately, and on and on and on. But we do love transplants. Direct seeding is going to be super quick. You get it straight in the ground. It's set it and forget it. You do have to come back and thin out all the little extra babies, but it's a one swoop it's one step. So you don't have to do multiple steps over and over again. So it's a little more efficient in your time, but you might lose more on the back end. So in terms of transplants, there are all of these products that can get sold to you. And if you can't tell, I don't like when products get sold to new gardeners because you lose a lot of time buying shiny new things. But we have this regular black plastic cell tray all the way on the left here. That's what's called a 72 cell tray. It's an industry standard. You're going to get 72 plants out of that tray. It's pretty much, there's like 4 sizes of them. You can have them in circular cells or in square cells. They fit together, they stack and store. They're really great. They are a plastic product, but if you treat them well, they last for many, many seasons. And so that is what I was sort of raised up on using and what I still use to this day. You see that there are a couple other products. You'll see these dome trays that actually in Louisiana create a lot of humidity. And you'll see they're also planting in like a coconut coir material, which has basically 0 nutrients in it. And so you'll have to begin to immediately fertilize once germination happens of that seed, because a seed itself has the nutrients in it to protect a plant until it gets past its first true leaves. So when that plant pops open, those first 2 little leaves are called its true leaves. And when it was wrapped up in its seed, there was enough food, just like in an egg, to get it to that point. And then any leaves past those 2 new leaves need to actually get nutrients from other sources. So if you miss the window and you've planted in something that has 0 nutrients, if you miss the window to feed it, you're going to start life with a nutrient deficiency on that plant. You know, I think you'll hear a lot more when you're getting the hydroponic and aquaponic lessons about what that process of feeding plants that are directly in substrates that don't have their own nutrients is like. You'll see a lot of those water-based growing or air-based growing are growing in spun rock wool or coir or clay pellets. And obviously those substrates are not feeding the plant. You're feeding the plant in other ways, either with fish or nutrient films. But in soil-based agriculture, one of the greatest things is that you can create a nutrient system from the soil that is regenerative. So I like to start with soil that has some nutrients in it. You can get seed starting mixes that are sterile, and I do recommend starting with sterile mixes. This is a really big misconception for new growers is they'll go out and they'll grab a bag of topsoil to start seedlings. You don't want to grab a bag of topsoil to start seedlings because topsoil is often like pretty rough. Its pH could be all over the place. It's made up of all sorts of things. Oftentimes there's a lot of ash put in it in order to darken it. And so you want to start with a seedling soil that you know what's in it. It has a very neutral pH and maybe the tiniest bit of nutrients, but you want it to be sterile because just like a little baby anything, those seedlings are susceptible to disease. Michael's asking, do certain trays or pots work better for certain plants? And that's a great question. I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. But for the most part, in order to not have, you know, like a bell and a whistle for every single thing, I like the 72 cell for its like consistently pretty good for most plants. So for whatever it might lose for one crop or the other, it gains by being generally sort of like holistically good for most things. It's almost like thinking back to that pH chart where there are, I'm not going to go back to it. There are some pHs that are better for some plants and some that are better for others, but the most middle of the road consistent thing is going to be like a 72 cell tray, because that less than 1 inch by 1 inch is just kind of like one size fits all. If you are growing a specialty crop that is not amenable to a 72 cell, then you should switch to something else. Flower growers oftentimes grow with much smaller cells. They grow with 288s. This is called a 72 cell tray because it's got 72 cells. If you can imagine, a 288 would have a ton of smaller cells. So there are going to be differences, but the most common industry standard vegetable tray is a 72. After a 72, you can bump up to a 6-pack, which is like exactly what you think it is. It's those 6 little pots together. You can bump up to a 4-inch pot. And one of the things I did want to point out is that the biodegradable, there are a lot of products out there that are these sort of like peat moss compressed or coconut coir compressed seedling trays that can be planted directly in the ground. Those can be good, but in our super humid climate, they can often also lead to fungal and root rot problems because they don't drain super well. And then if you have them in a hot greenhouse, when it is really, really hot outside and you need to be watering really frequently, then they degrade really fast. So, and certain people like them. I just tend towards a classic 72 cell because they're bleachable too. So if you have a plant disease problem, you should be bleaching them in between multiple uses so that you're not breeding disease in your greenhouse. So to avoid having to buy an expensive formulated blend, if you want to buy an expensive formulated blend, I recommend BX Mycorrhizae. But to avoid having to buy these $70 bags of soil, I like 3 parts green compost, 1 part perlite, 1 part vermiculite, and 2 parts sphagnum peat moss that can be replaced with coconut coir, because peat moss is a pretty unsustainable product. It's pretty environmentally nasty product. I go a little lighter on the compost than a lot of people go, because I think down here in the Southeast, we have a lot of water, and damping off of your seedlings, which is the death of your seedlings from a fungal disease, is just really rampant in greenhouses because there's so much standing water. And going back to the concept of compost being high in organic matter and being able to hold a lot of water, if you're cutting down on that compost, then you're cutting down on how long that water sits on the roots of your plant. And the perlite and the vermiculite are going to be what increases drainage. They're vulcanized rock products. And so they're going to allow for more drainage. That sphagnum peat moss is also going to be what helps hold water, or coconut coir, which is again a good replacement. And if you're finding that formula also holds too much water, then you could cut whatever your peat or your coir is in half as well, depending on what your watering process is. A big thing to say to new seed starters is Well, A, watering depends on season. So if it's hot out, you're going to need to water more. If it's cold out, you're going to need to water less. And you don't want to overwater seedlings. And when you water them, you want to be watering them in a diffuse way. So never want a full stream of water going on baby seedlings or on seeds that have just been planted in the soil, because it'll disturb the soil, throw the seed out of the tray. Or if you're talking about a tiny baby seedling, it'll disturb the root structure and make the little baby plant lay flat. And it's just a hard knock early in life that we try to avoid. So love like a rosette of water, which can be a watering can. It can be a spigot on your hose, or it can be a classic thumb over the hose and then standing back and making sure that how that water is falling is gentle. But the biggest thing is that transplants require full sun. Like a lot of the time people will think that transplants are a really good method to start plants because they can do it inside their house, but you actually cannot start vegetable transplants inside your house because there is definitely not enough sun unless you live in a solarium, which is awesome. And I would like to see that, but I'm going to show a picture. Oh, where did my little picture go?
This is the garden.
Here it is. So I wanted to show this picture to show that you can use like large beds to bump up seedlings. You can actually pluck them out of a larger bed and put them into a 72. And when I was looking for pictures, I found this one that also exemplifies what happens when seedlings don't get enough light. So the height of those seedlings is far too long. If they're starting to look like threads or hairs or angel hair pasta, they didn't get enough light. And unfortunately, it's unfixable. When your seedlings are stretched, it means that they stretched for light, and there's no going back on that. You might be able to get, you may be able to get an okay crop out of them, but you're not going to get the same crop that you would have, if you had, given the correct amount of sunlight to begin with. So this right here is a really good example of a crop that is just too stretched. And I think most beginning gardeners can remember a time where they had like a seedling that was like this long. They're like, it's so big, but it's so big because it was reaching out for sun, unfortunately. So we're gonna do a quick watch of just I didn't want to bring us outside here at our greenhouse because it's dark and it requires multiple camera angles. So I found a quick 3-minute video that I thought was really pretty good and comprehensive about direct seeding. And we're gonna quickly watch that together.
This is the Garden Minute brought to you by Swedish Covenant Hospital.
We can't hear it, Margie.
You can't hear it at all. Darn. Well, I guess I'm not as tech savvy as I thought I was. I will, I'm gonna narrate it.
Perfect.
This is the Garden Minute brought to you by Swedish Covenant Hospital.
Okay, so essentially when planting a seed, there are a couple of considerations. One is the size of the seed, and also it's going to be the germination rate as well. So on the package of a seed, there is always going to be legally a germination rate, and that's going to be anywhere from, I think legally it has to be above 65%, which means that out of 100 seeds, 65% of them, or 65 seeds, would germinate, and that's going to inform how many seeds you want to be planting. So if you have a low germination rate on a seed, say it's in the 70 range, which is very low actually, then you want to be planting more than one seed per hole, unless it is a very valuable seed, so that you get full germination. In terms of depth, when you're planting a seed, a general good rule is to plant a seed 2 times the depth of the diameter of the seed itself. So if you think of a sunflower seed, it's a good way to, well, let's do vegetables. We're going to do a pea because it looks like that's what she's planting in this video. You're going to plant that pea seed 2 pea seeds deep. And that is because a seed, when we talked earlier about the idea that there is nutrients inside of that seed, it has a specific amount of nutrients that is enough to get it to the surface of the soil and then take it from there. If you put it too close to the surface of the soil, what's going to happen is it's going to have its roots exposed to the sun because it's going to try to germinate too high and it's not going to have the space to drill down into the soil that it needs. But it's also going to have too much extra stuff left with it that it didn't eat, and that can lead to it actually rotting. And if you go too deep, it'll run out of food before it gets to the surface. So what we say when we teach kids is that like a seed packs a bag lunch, basically. And you want it to be emerging into the world right as it finishes eating its bag lunch, not before, not after. So always read the seed packet, but for the most part, you can assume that 2 times the diameter of the seed is a safe place to start. So if you have a teeny tiny seed, it's really hard to figure out what is 2 times the diameter. I'm going to pause so we can see her broadcast seed, but it's hard to figure out what is 2 times the diameter of a teeny tiny seed. So in that case, you're going to have to be a little bit more intuitive. And what we try to do is make sure that unless we read that seed packet, always want to read that seed packet, unless we read it and it says that light is required for germination, which is very rare for a vegetable crop. It's not unheard of, but it's rare, and that's going to happen more for specialty flowers and herbs. Unless it says that light is required, you want to just make sure that that seed is fully covered by soil. And that is because it needs dark to cue germination, and it's also going to need contact with the soil in order to have uniform moisture in order to cue germination. So what I actually really wanted her video to illustrate is broadcast seeding. So when we're coming through and we're direct seeding a seed, which is going to be the same thing that you're doing in the tray versus in the ground, then you're going to that 2 times the diameter depth. But some seedlings you want to space so close, and I will give you a spacing guide, but you want to space so incredibly close, let's say radish, for example, that it actually makes less sense for you to come through and plant each individual radish seed, and more sense for you to do either broadcasting, which means sort of evenly distributing that seed on the soil surface, or channel seeding, which means making a furrow with your finger and filling that channel with those seeds, and then recovering in both situations. So with broadcasting, you're sort of lightly sprinkling seeds on the surface of the soil, like sprinkles on a cupcake, and then you're coming back over with soil to cover those seeds up and tamping it down, because you don't want a ton of airspace between the seed and the soil. That airspace will mean that the seed is not getting direct contact with the moisture that is needed for its germination. And also, if there's a lot of airspace between it, that's a place for light to creep in as well. So we don't want light, and we do want moisture. And then with channel seeding, we're closing that furrow back up. Generally, it's nice to just make the furrow as deep as you want the seed to be. And then when you're closing it back up, that means the appropriate amount of soil is there on the soil surface. So we're going to watch her broadcast her seed. So she's sprinkling it on the soil surface. And you don't want to do this with a high value crop. This is where transplanting would come in and be really helpful, because you could control, if you had 100 seeds total and you needed 70 plants, you could control exactly where those seeds were going into each individual cell and make sure that you were getting the yield that you needed to out of the packet of seeds. And see, then she is just pressing that soil surface And with that small of a seed, the pressing of the soil surface is going to be enough to bury that seed 2 times the diameter of that teeny tiny seed. So that's something that you're going to do with a lot of your root crops that are close growing, your carrots, your radishes, your beets. Those things are going to be direct seeded like that, and they're going to be most often broadcast or channel seeded and then thinned down to their appropriate distance from one another. So it makes more sense economically for you to plant 1,000 carrot seeds and come through and thin them down to 500 carrot seeds than it does for you to try to plant 500 tiny individual carrot seeds in different holes that are appropriately spaced from one another, especially considering that carrots are going to have erratic germination. And so that same concept can be applied to a lot of your root crops. All right, I'm going to come back. So good soil contact, read the packet, immediately water after planting, and 2 times the width of a seed. And then your direct seeding is going to be good for finicky seeds and root crops. So there's a difference between a finicky seed and an expensive seed. An expensive seed you want to try to transplant, but when I say finicky, a lot of crops cannot handle transplant. They hate being transplanted. So for example, the reason a carrot is both finicky and a root crop, but the reason that we direct seed carrots is because that initial tap root that they put down, that first little root that they send down is the carrot. And if it has any sort of disturbance, if it's transplanted at all, then those tiny, tiny root hairs get really frustrated and they kind of stop growing or die. It's the same thing as if you rock a carrot when it's not big enough. If you move it a little bit, all of those root hairs that connect that large taproot to the soil, they can break really easily. And so you can kill a carrot, or not kill it, but harvest it too early accidentally by just shaking it. So we want to get that crop directly seeded in the soil so that that contact with the root hairs is consistent and there's no interruption in it. So do you have to water seeds immediately after planting, or should you pre-water? Great question. So when we say pre-water, there's a couple things that we mean. One is that you can pre-soak seeds before planting. I like pre-soaking some seeds. It isn't necessary. It will quicken your germination rate. So there are very few crops where you have to pre-soak the seeds. Most of them are not vegetable crops, but it can be helpful if you have a little extra time and you think you can do it in a sanitary way to pre-soak those pea seeds, anything that's sort of big and needs to get plumped up before it germinates. The one thing about that is that if you leave them a little bit too long, or if there's not enough aeration with your water, it can actually lead to more rotting of your crops down the road. If your seeds are too wet for too long, they can rot. And so pre-soaking is a nice technique if you feel like you're really on your timing. I wouldn't pre-soak if you feel like you might miss the window, if you might leave them there a little bit too long. But you always want your soil to be wet before you plant into it. So if you're preparing a seed bed in the field, or if you're directly seeding into a tray, you want to make sure that that soil is like, if you were to grab a handful of it and squeeze it, 1 or 2 drops of water would fall out, no more, because you also don't want it to be waterlogged. With a field or a garden, if you are experiencing a period of drought, the water holding capacity of the soil is going to be down, because the soil is being constantly replenished through rain, and there is just a natural amount of water in the soil. If we haven't had rain in a very long time, and if the only water that has been hitting your garden is municipal water, which is going to be high in salts, then that is just really hard footing for a new seed. So pre-watering is a good idea. Maybe even just putting out a sprinkler for 30 or so minutes the day before can even be helpful, so that there's just some moisture return to that soil. but then you also want to just be immediately watering those seeds in, because it helps the soil settle onto the seed and make that direct contact that you really need. Okay. And here are those root crops and those bulbs and corms. So just to give people a little bit of an idea, asparagus, garlic, onion sets, strawberries, and shallots are all going to be planted with different root structures than a regular seed. That right there is asparagus crowns, which have been dug and are being retransplanted. And you can start asparagus from seed. It's actually really fun to start asparagus from seed, but it takes a very long time to get to harvest if you start from seed. So mostly folks will opt to buy crowns so that they're already purchasing that really big root structure, which all of the energy of the plant goes towards establishing for the first couple of years. You don't really harvest asparagus until it is pretty established. So skipping the step of those 5 years of waiting and buying your crowns is really nice. Variety selection of seeds. So you're looking for disease-resistant varieties and tried and true Southeastern varieties. A lot of the time, seed catalogs are tailored towards the sort of mid-Atlantic region, or California or the North, where a lot of our vegetable production is. So I think that focusing on Southeastern varieties of seeds can be really nice for supporting Southeastern agriculture, but also for finding varieties that are more adapted to growing down here. I put SES in parentheses. Southern Exposure Seeds is really awesome. High Mowing Seeds is really great. Those two companies are in the sort of more southern region, and do some really cool stuff with open pollinated seed varieties and hybridization that I really like. So checking those guys out is wonderful. But then also just going through reputable seed companies is so key. Junky seed is junky seed. And I definitely will buy like a 99-cent pack of a Cosmos from the Dollar General if I can't find it. But you do need to know that in terms of seed production, you actually, like very few things in this world, like the cost is actually important, because the quality of the seed and the disease resistance of the seed and the time and energy that someone's put into breeding or protecting the lineage of that seed is all represented, in the plant later down the road. So I said, no shady seeds, please. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of grifters on Etsy and on eBay and definitely Amazon that sell fake plants, fake seeds, all that kind of stuff. And while it could just be a silly way to piddle away a couple dollars, it also can introduce weed seeds to your garden. So sometimes people will sell really noxious weed seeds that they have a ton of as a scam on those websites. And while there are certainly overregulated things in the world, I think seed regulation is really important for protecting seed stock and for cutting down on disease and invasive species. So always go with a reputable seed company. Timing and spacing. So the timing and spacing of planting your vegetable garden, I didn't dedicate a ton of time to it, though it is something that people always want to talk about because there are these amazing guides. And really things like this, what you should be doing is creating your own guide that works for your yard next to the resources that exist. So there are local guides. You can share these things with your friends, with your neighbors, and talk about what works for you and keep notes. But really, at the end of the day, the classic LSU guide, I think you guys can still see me, yeah. This classic LSU vegetable guide that I've pulled up, everyone who's a gardener probably has seen this before just from a basic Google search. This thing is tried and true. And also, caveat, it's changing a little bit because our climate is changing. And so I like this because I have annotation on mine from over the years that has helped me adapt what I've learned from this resource that is also developed out of Baton Rouge. So again, a different freeze date, a different climate, but this is a really, really good and well-researched guide. It was published in the 80s. So like I said, temperatures have changed, especially considering that this is for the more central Louisiana region. But what you'll see, what I really like about this guide is that it's got your spring seeding dates and your fall seeding dates. So most other seeding charts are going to go by your frost dates and think that they can handle the whole country, but they can't because they don't know Southeast Louisiana, where we oftentimes don't have any freeze. Or sometimes we have a really late freeze and we had no other freeze. So having both a spring date and a fall date accounts for the fact that we have a 12-month growing season, and a lot of other places just absolutely do not. So what you're looking for just in terms of interpretation of this resource is that that's your first date to your last. So 2/15 to 5/15 are going to be the days that you can plant those snap beans in spring, and then coming back up in fall, you can start in August and go until September. Now, what I want y'all to think about in terms of our seasons being a tiny bit different and making your own notes on guides like this is that if we don't get a freeze, there isn't a reason that 9/10, that September 10th final planting date, is not because of sunlight, it's because of freeze. And so that's the last day that they're assuming that you could get this days to harvest right over here. That's the last day that they're assuming that you could get this crop in the ground and be safe to get some sort of production off of it before a first freeze date. But if we don't have a first freeze date, you could theoretically plant your snap bush beans all the way through back around into the spring. So knowing that you can push these things a little bit, but using this as a general guide is really, really helpful. So thinking a little bit about, what are we planting now? We have already missed the window. I think things like this are really interesting to see. We think of Brussels sprouts as this deep winter vegetable, but if we have, this is 90 asterisks, I think that asterisk means something means it's a lot bigger because Brussels sprouts do not take 90 days to grow. Thinking of that as a 120-day crop, if you're harvesting that in the dead of winter or in the beginning of spring, then it needed to go in August or September. So I really like to keep this guide with me. It helps contextualize, and then it's also got this really awesome spacing chart. So this is accurate. When I say those planting dates have scooched around a little bit since the 80s because of both climate change and regional differences, this space between plants is based on research for disease, for airflow, for all that good stuff coming straight out of LSU Ag Center, and I really, really like it. It's also got, you'll see the depth to plant seeds. So again, read your packet, then you've got your fallback of the 2 times the diameter of the seed, but you've also got this right here. So carrots, 1/8 of an inch, which is teeny tiny. You're not going to be able to, totally see what 1/8 of an inch looks like, but it's nice to have this as a guide because you can look at a ruler and conceptualize of what 1/8 of an inch might look like. So I hope I'm going to get my garlic in the ground this weekend, and I'm really excited about it. But this has got almost everything on it. You'll see some pretty glaring gaps in terms of culturally appropriate crops for some of our new American communities. There's no Asian vegetables on this list. There are not really that many specialty vegetables on here. I don't think artichoke's even on here. So I'm hoping that we can do some community data gathering and get this updated sometime soon, but it's a really good guide. Yeah. And you'll see there's also recommended varieties. I will say, the ones that are on here are still good varieties, but they were recommended varieties in 1980, and there's a lot of other varieties now. So yeah, feel free to experiment with the varieties that you're picking, as long as you're looking at the wisdom of Southeastern growers, because that'll be much more helpful for you. Make sure to get things in on schedule and talk to others about slight pushes and weather changes. Planting off schedule leads to death and disease of plants. It also leads to irregular flowering or plants dying out just generally because of heat. So plants are going to be either temperature dependent or sunlight dependent. So a lot of plants actually flower based on the length of the day. And it's not just that you could trick them by keeping them warmer or cooler. It's actually that they're not going to set fruit, or they're going to try to set fruit way too early if you plant them off season. But then you'll see something like cilantro, which once it gets in its head that it wants to bolt, that it wants to bolt, which is the process of it sending up a flower stalk and trying to end its life by creating seeds. That happens when it's warm outside. And so if you plant your cilantro off season and you were hoping to get it to market, and we start having warmer days earlier than you were expecting, it'll start bolting, and most of your crop will be basically ruined because it'll be trying to send up its woody stalk that produces seeds and flowers instead of that short, tender, leafy cilantro. So the timing really does matter, because your crop will behave in a way that might be completely different from what you need it to be. And then I really encourage people to follow spacing guidelines. It can be very tempting to try to cramp things together. We're about to do a quick overview of plant diseases, and a number one thing in avoiding the spread of bacterial and viral diseases, as well as the introduction of fungal diseases, is going to be appropriately spacing your plants for airflow, so that bugs aren't able to jump from one leaf to the other and vector disease. So really not treating that as like a silly guideline, but something that's integral to plant health is important. I'm going to go back into present mode somehow. There we go. Okay, we're talking about sickness, plant disease. So something that is really helpful to beginners, but oftentimes we gloss over it and we think like they don't need to know about that yet. I actually think very differently, that we should talk about plant disease early on, because it's one of those things that when stuff starts going wrong with your plants, you don't understand what it is, then you get it in your head that you're bad at growing. And what it actually probably is that you live in Southeast Louisiana, where we have a constant barrage of bugs and disease. And especially in a new garden, that ecosystem is going to be off balance, and you're going to have even more than other people. And so in order to protect your ego, I am telling you about your diseases early on. So the disease triangle of basically any disease in any population, this is kind of an interesting thing to be talking about during a pandemic, is that disease can only happen if the disease triangle is complete. So you have a pathogen, which is the fungal disease, the bacterial disease, the viral disease, whatever the thing is that you're trying to avoid, but the environment has to be appropriate for that thing to live, and there has to be a susceptible host. So you can have a bacterial disease, and if your environment is dry and warm and cool and doesn't facilitate that bacteria growing, even if you have a susceptible host, you don't have a completed triangle, and your host can't get sick because the bacteria can't thrive in that environment. Now, if you had an environment that's perfect for that bacteria to thrive and it's out of control, but you don't have a host that can get sick from that bacteria, then you don't have a disease triangle. But when everything is achieved, that is when you have plant disease happen. So you're trying to always mitigate these things on the front end and not end up dealing with disease, but preventing it. So the biggest thing that I want to impart to people is that there are abiotic or environmental reasons that your plants might not thrive. Obviously, that's moisture, like maybe you are underwatering, overwatering, temperature, light, the nutrients, so making sure that your soil's in balance, and pH. But there are also chemical factors. To quickly clarify, abiotic means non-living. So these are the things that can kill your plants that are not fungal, viral, or bacterial. So chemical air pollution is actually really detrimental. So we see this picture right here is ozone damage on a watermelon plant. think we really underestimate how often our plants get sick from ozone damage, from sunlight from like burning from sunlight, and from general air pollution. And that's a really big thing to talk about here in, along the Mississippi River, because we do have so many manufacturing plants along the river, and the air pollution really does impact plant growth, especially those tender herbaceous vegetable plants. So just because your plant starts dying out of nowhere doesn't necessarily mean you're cursed. It could mean that you have drift from other chemicals coming from a nearby train track, could mean that there's air pollution, or there could be salt damage. This is where that soil tissue testing is really going to come in handy, because honestly, if I looked at picture C right here on a watermelon in a field, I would tell you that that was like really heavily progressed iron deficiency and whitefly damage. I would come see that and I would be like, ooh, this is probably that you have an iron deficiency and then you got whiteflies, which is a pest. It would not occur to me that that was ozone damage. Even looking at it, I'm still tricked by it. And so having that tissue sample of a plant, if your crop starts going sideways, is really helpful in closing those gaps. So the next big category, so our big categories for our biotic plant diseases, which are our living plant diseases, are viral, bacterial, and fungal. So viral diseases, what are the indicators? How do you treat them? How did it happen? And how do you prevent it? So here are two pictures that I think are really illustrative of viral diseases in plants. And the way that I like to explain how viruses look in plants is that they're often beautiful. Viruses are obviously getting in, they're hijacking the cells, and they're recreating themselves. And sometimes a nice way to think about a virus is that it'll manifest itself almost looking pixelated, because viruses are very methodical and calculating, and they hijack these chunks of cells and connect to one another. So it almost looks like a pixelated computer problem when you see a virus. The other kind of signs of a viral disease, and you're never going to be 100% able to diagnose something just from looks. Even people who that's their profession, there always can be an underlying thing that's creating the symptom rather than what you think there might be. But other things that are really indicative of viruses are going to be strange shapes and behaviors on the plants. So like curling and maybe like fruit getting really weird and big. All of those things can be virus symptoms. I keep these with me and have always for a long time. There are going to be some management strategies on each one of these slides. We're not going to go through all of the management strategies, but what I am going to say is there are examples on each one of these slides for avoidance, exclusion, eradication, and protection. And those are going to be your management strategies for any disease. So you want to first avoid it, you want to then exclude it, you want to eradicate it, and you want to protect against it. So especially with a virus, you're not going to be able to treat a virus. Unfortunately, in plants, once you have viruses, you need to destroy the plant material and not compost it. You need to burn it or bag it and get it out of there, because viruses are very rough and they can stay in the soil for a long time and jump from plant family to plant family. Bacterial. So bacterial diseases are going to look a lot more like rots. So if viruses are like little computer programs getting in there and hijacking your plant cells, and I know I'm dumbing all this down, but like this is actually how I think of it too. I'm not patronizing anyone. Bacterial diseases are going to be like if something got infected and started rotting. So whenever, if you've ever had something like you put an orange on the counter, it can get fuzzy and mold, and that's a fungus, and we'll talk about that. But sometimes you cut something open and it's rotten on the inside. So like black, slimy, smelly, all of those kinds of things are going to be indicative of bacterial diseases on plants. And bacterial diseases on plants are going to happen because of poor sanitation and that disease triangle being complete. So slimy things and rotty things are going to jump from one thing to the next. It's like an infection moving from one wound to another. And you're going to handle that mostly with sanitation, just like you would with, you know, an animal or a person. You want to clean things up. You want to get the sickness out of there. You want to get the disease out of there. And one of the worst things about bacteria is they actually can hijack the vascular system of a plant and clog it up. So a lot of those wilts that you see that are indicative of bacterial diseases are actually because the veins of the plant are fully clogged with bacteria. So that can be a really big indicator of bacterial disease. And then fungal. So fungal diseases are huge down here in the Southeast. They're going to happen because it's too wet, because it's too dry, because it's too cold, because it's too warm. There's a fungus for everything. I put the two main culprits on here, which is powdery mildew and downy mildew. Powdery mildew's on the top of leaves, and it looks like somebody came through and put baby powder on everything. Downy mildew's on the bottom of leaves, and it's going to look like black that's growing, like a dusty black that's growing up on the bottom. With downy mildew, what you're actually going to see from the top of the leaf is the symptoms of the fungus happening from the top. So there's yellowing because that fungus on the other side is decaying the plant. But the actual pathogen is on the bottom of the leaf. So for funguses, they are going to be the biggest one that you want to make sure you're creating a lot of airflow in your crops by spacing them appropriately, but then also, this is big with your viruses and your fungus, is that you want to be weeding. And the reason that weeding is really important is not because, you know, it's aesthetic. It's because weeds both harbor disease and pests, and that disease triangle fully closes when you have weeds around, because all of these diseases are like, don't affect weeds. They're so strong. They're so capable. So they harbor that disease on them. And the minute your soft, sweet baby plant gets out there and it's susceptible to the disease, it's going to jump right over there onto your plant. So whenever you see a lot of disease in a field or a lot of bug pressure in a field or garden, there's also probably usually a weed problem to go along with it. Because if you have a clean, mulched field with very few weeds or a really good weed control strategy, then there's not really anywhere, that's how you're closing the triangle, you don't have an environment for the pathogen to exist. So if you can avoid having a place that can harbor that pathogen, it can be in a bug. You know, a lot of the viruses that you're going to get in your plants are actually going to come from a bug biting and sucking the plant, because they jump from host to host. And if they get a virus in their dirty little mouths and they bite the next plant, they're going to spread that virus along with them down the line. And bugs don't care if they take one bite of something and they don't finish it. They'll just keep moving down and infecting every plant that you have. And then I'm not going to go into them too much, but it's always a nice relief for people to find out that there are occasionally soil-borne nematodes. I always have one or two people in every class who are like, wait a minute, I'm not crazy. There is something that's really like weird going on with my plants and it's not me. So if you're seeing these nodules on your root systems and they're not on your leguminous crops, where nodules like this, going back to the beginning, are indicative of those nitrogen fixing bacteria living in the roots and fixing nitrogen from the air. If you're seeing nodules like this on anything other than a legume, it means that you might have nematodes in the soil. And nematodes are essentially teeny tiny little soil worms that build their homes in nodules on the roots of your plant. And they are just generally really destructive to plant life. So they cause stunting, they'll cause disease, and they'll cause your plants to just die out of nowhere. Unfortunately, there's very little mitigation for nematodes, especially the kind of nematodes that are pictured here, which are root knot nematodes. There's some great research about getting crab shells and shrimp shells into the soil because they don't like being around crab shells and shrimp shells. But for the most part, moving where you're planting or planting nematode resistant crops is going to be your best bet for mitigating nematodes in your soil. My final thoughts that I'm going to breeze through. I always talk longer than I thought I would. Water deeply and infrequently. Timers, tape, and sprinkler are all your friends. putting drip tape down or soaker hoses down on your crops that you want to have direct watering of those root systems is awesome. And then having overhead sprinklers as an option for crops that need overhead watering for germination. So when you are putting down direct drip, it needs to be on established plants. But if you're broadcast seeding, like we learned about, then you need constant overhead seeding, constant overhead watering in the field, because that drip tape won't make contact with anything that is a couple of inches away from it. But you don't want to sprinkler as often as you want anywhere, and you definitely don't want to do it in the middle of the day because you're going to lose a lot of that water to evaporation. So that's where your timer comes in. Watering in the middle of the night or early in the morning is going to be one of the most water conserving ways that you can water. Stay on top of your pests by physically removing them. There is not one, short of doing full bug ID, there's not going to be a way to give people a whole picture of pest control in southeastern growing other than getting into the field, because we have so many bugs in our climate. But my best general rule for people is that if a bug is hard-bodied, using neem, pyrethrin, also spinosad, but diatomaceous earth are awesome ways to handle them. But hand picking is always your first line of defense, because any of those things can also hurt your pollinators. What's not on there is spinosad, so I'll make sure to add it before we share this. And then that diatomaceous earth, or DE, that I have on here, oftentimes people will try to use it on soft-bodied insects. It doesn't work on soft-bodied insects. On your soft-bodied insects, like your worms, you want to use BT, which is a bacterial toxin that makes worms sick and kills them after they eat it, or hand picking. So hand picking and planting trap crops to get all of those soft-bodied insects somewhere far away from the crop that you are trying to grow is going to be your best bet. And then drilling at home, soil testing, and fertilizing with liquid and granulars. These are kind of recaps from earlier. You can do a liquid fertilizer to address some of those deficiencies that you might be seeing in the field, and that's going to be quicker than a granular fertilizer. So you want to do granular amendments, or the ones that I said looked like, cat food or something like that. Those are going to be long-term solutions, but your liquids are going to be quicker fixes. And I think that is it. So I brought us right to time. And that means that if we have questions, I can quickly answer them, but we're going to be doing this survey right now. So if everyone would start doing this survey, and I can answer questions while we do that together. We do really need participation in that survey because, like I said, this is a USDA program, and we are able to put it on with their support. And so we have to demonstrate that people are actually, coming to these classes and getting big takeaways from them in order to keep doing free community programming. So if everyone would do us the kindness of taking that survey, we would love it. And I am here to answer any questions while you do that. Just to make sure everyone sees this in the chat, if you would please select that you're answering this survey for today's class, 11/5/2020.
And while we have you guys here still, Recirculating Farms has been doing a video short series about, or just having small videos about various things from starting a bed to cover crops. So be on the lookout for those videos.
I'm really thankful that you guys came out tonight, and I know that people are working on their surveys, and we're very thankful that you all are participating in those. Like I said, it really helps us. I'm going to hang out here in case anyone has any questions, but RFC team, if y'all, or Recirculating Farms team, if y'all have anything else to add. But otherwise, I'll just kind of hang here and let people trickle out. We have a question about spraying beneficial nematodes. Claire, I have, yes, thank you, Marianne. Reminder to sign up for those remaining on-farm opportunities. Specifically, there's the is it aquaponics or hydroponics that y'all are doing? Aquaponics. Yeah, so reminder about those. So in terms of spraying beneficial nematodes, I have not had any success with that. We've had really, really bad root knot nematodes at the garden for a while, and we got both a soak and a spray from, I think, a company called Arbico, I believe. And it was not helpful to us, but I have heard that on a large scale, it can be really helpful if you can do like a really efficient job of application. I think that, you know, it's a, nematodes are really difficult. They make a garden feel almost usable. We did have some positive reaction from the chitin that that we used when we got some shrimp compost once, but like I said, we did not have really any improvement with the beneficial nematodes. Claire, that doesn't mean that other people wouldn't, and I've heard good things, but personally I have not been impressed. Ooh, are there signs of over-fertilization? Yes, sirree, there are. So over-fertilization is mostly going to show up as burning of plants. So one of those abiotic factors, the look of a plant just all of a sudden being crispy or stressed out or just burnt up, is going to be from over-fertilization, generally of nitrogen. If you're applying organic nitrogen, you can absolutely burn your plants and over-fertilize them. If you are applying organic phosphorus, potassium, or any of your micronutrients, with the exception of zinc, you're not going to have that big of a problem with over-fertilization. Over-fertilization is going to manifest itself in synthetic fertilizers and heavy nitrogen. And the other thing is that when you're over-fertilizing, what you're doing is you're building up salts in the soil as well. So you are long-term, you're negatively impacting the soil microbes too, because you can, just as much as you can damage those plants, you can also damage the soil structure. So what you're looking for when you're looking for fertilizer damage is really going to look similar to ozone damage, salt toxicity, or it's just sometimes immediate death. Are water filters worth it? That's a very interesting question. Like particulate filters for watering systems, or filters for removing salts from water? I'll speak to both of them. I'm a big fan of like trap filters for irrigation systems. They save you a lot of money because your irrigation system can easily be damaged by particulate in your water lines. I believe Claire was out at the farm the other weekend when we did a little bit of irrigation, looked at a little bit of our irrigation, and there are, you know, often things that crawl up into your irrigation pipes or get in through just futzing around in the garden, and they can rip holes in your drip tape or just create serious buildup long-term in your irrigation system that leads to a lot of expensive replacement over time. And to speak to water filters that remove, you know, salts and minerals from water, I would throw that question to aquaponics a little differently, and because I would bet with aquaponics they're super worth it, but I don't actually know the answer to that. Land-based agriculture, I tend away from them, not because they're not good, but because to get like serious water filtration of city water, it's going to be really expensive. Now, it's going to be expensive, and the impact is going to be that you're not having to replace your irrigation as often because of those mineral buildups, but also that your plants are going to be a little bit healthier because they're not going to be dealing with some of that fluoride and the highly alkaline water that's coming from the city. What was I going to say? Oh, that if you're using rainwater, you know, UV treatment or filtration of rainwater is very much worth it in order to make that rainwater safe to use on crops. So a couple of answers, I guess I don't know the answer with aquaponics. If you're trying to filter out particulate, those are really inexpensive and awesome. And yes, I do recommend those. They just go at the top of at the beginning of your hose. If you have a Mozzie for fertilizer injection, or any sort of a timer will come with a filter. Those are just great, and they're like $10. If you are trying to remove minerals from water, I tend to think for land-based agriculture, it's not worth it. Not because it's not great, but because it's very expensive. And then if you're using surface water or rainwater, then filters are essential in order to create safe situations with water. What kind of weird stuff should I look for with using well water? Yeah, so salt is going to be a big one. You're going to want to make sure that there isn't a big salt buildup. Minerals are generally not necessarily bad. They're just indicative of other kinds of salts and buildups that'll wear away at your irrigation over time. A lot of those minerals can actually be good. You know, if getting calcium into your field through your water supply is definitely not a bad thing, but you want to be remembering that if there's a heavy mineral concentration, there's often a heavy salt concentration that could build up as well. So yeah, just get that water tested. The other thing I would worry about is any old pipes leaking into an old well or septic systems leaking in. Just making sure that the well water is still in good shape. But your biggest culprit in bad irrigation of crops is going to be salts. That's what you want to avoid. And then again, toxicity, or not toxicity, but contamination via fecal matter that could come in from surface water, or just rainwater generally being you're not allowed to immediately irrigate food crops with that rainwater. So filtration and purification of rainwater and surface water is key if you want to be using recycled water on your farm. And there's really cool, I do want to just shout it out, there's like really cool UV filtration systems or UV purification systems that are used on farms they're not crazy expensive for turning rainwater into drinking water. So look those up. And I'm happy to send along resources if anyone's interested. Very cool. Well, I'm always available via email if anyone needs anything or wants to follow up or has any questions. And I so appreciate y'all spending your evening with us, because we know you could have spent it anywhere else. Hope everyone has a really wonderful night.